My unfaithful wife believed that an affair would somehow strengthen our marriage, but I had a different strategy in mind. Sherry assumed I was in the dark about her intentions. She likely thought I was either naive or completely blind to the growing relationship between her and her coworker, Todd. She believed I'd accept her actions and tolerate her continued involvement with him. However, she was in for a surprise. She didn't know that I'd been suspicious for quite a while. There were clear signs, including her working late more often, upgrading her wardrobe, acting more physical, and losing interest in activities we used to enjoy together. When I tried bringing up my concerns, she brushed them off, attributing my feelings to jealousy or possessiveness. Since Sherry disregarded my attempts to discuss it, I had no option but to hire a private investigator. I couldn't go on being oblivious. From the start of our relationship, I'd made it clear and reminded her throughout our 10 years together that I'd never tolerate cheating. So with mixed feelings, I sat in private investigator Jake Sloan's office and listened to his report. At first, I felt relieved when he said Sherry hadn't actually cheated. However, that relief was brief when he added, "for now." As he explained, my wife was engaged in an affair, though it hadn't turned physical yet. Apparently, she and Todd called each other work spouses, a term I found revolting because, in my view, she had only one spouse, me. While some might consider that label harmless or even cute, to me it signaled a deep betrayal. According to Sloan's findings, Sherry and Todd had private lunches daily, held hands, and sat close together. The investigator provided plenty of photos of them hugging and, on occasion, even kissing. It made me furious, and I wanted to confront Todd right then and there. In addition to lunching together, they also stayed late at work, although there seemed to be no genuine reason for it. It seemed they just wanted to spend as much time as possible away from their spouses. The detective was also able to access Sherry's messages and emails. I knew this was illegal and couldn't be used in divorce proceedings, but I wanted to know the truth, regardless. While divorcing on grounds of infidelity was possible in our state, it was difficult, and a no-fault divorce was easier anyway. Sloan wouldn't let me see the actual messages, nor would he give me copies. Instead, he summarized their contents. He assured me that Sherry never said anything negative about me, though Todd occasionally did. Each time she defended me, which could have been worse, I supposed. Their messages confirmed the romance, and though they hadn't declared love for each other, the exchanges bordered on sexting. Todd had sent my wife suggestive pictures, and she responded with photos of her bare chest. Thankfully, Sloan said she hadn't sent anything more explicit yet. As I sat in his office, considering my next move, Sloan gave me the worst news of all. Todd's wife would be out of town for 3 days visiting her mother, and the pair planned to use that time to consummate their relationship. The only obstacle, apparently, was me, as they hadn't yet figured out a way to spend the night together if I stayed around. Since I had no intention of going anywhere, it left them scrambling for options. They discussed a few ideas, one of which was for Sherry to claim she was going on a girls-only weekend trip. She was hesitant, though, worried that if I spoke to her friends, I might uncover the truth. Ultimately, she ruled that out because she didn't want to involve anyone else in creating a cover story. Their other plan involved trying to get me to leave town, which was laughable in itself. I remembered Sherry casually suggesting I plan a weekend golf trip with my friends, but I dismissed the idea. Eventually, they chose a new and straightforward approach: honesty. Todd, thinking I'd soon be a resigned husband, was convinced I'd let Sherry do what she pleased to keep her happy in our marriage. He persuaded her that sleeping with him would improve our romantic life and even strengthen our relationship. According to Todd, all Sherry needed to do was inform me of her intentions, and I'd reluctantly agree to her need. Todd had clearly misread my resolve. What stunned me most was that Sherry actually bought into his manipulative scheme. It should have been obvious to her that I wouldn't stand for this. If she didn't know that by now, maybe she was deluding herself. Sloan concluded the report, and I thanked him for the information before heading home. I asked him to keep an eye on her messages and update me if anything changed. On Friday, Sloan called to tell me that Sherry intended to approach me on Monday after work. She planned to tell me that she'd be going out with Todd on Friday night, starting with dinner and dancing, and that they'd be spending the night at a hotel. She'd then thoughtfully return home by Saturday, or perhaps Sunday, depending on how things went. The two of them had practiced her speech, reassuring themselves that I'd comply. They anticipated my anger and initial resistance, but Sherry intended to soothe me by insisting it would be a one-time thing, though both knew otherwise. She even mentioned having intimate time with me afterward as a reward for being so understanding, assuming I'd accept her returning to me after Todd. How considerate of them to think of my needs. With just 2 days to prepare for her planned discussion, Sherry and Todd jokingly referred to it as an intervention. I was resolute about making their so-called intervention my own turning point. Over the weekend, I mulled over different possibilities, questioning whether our marriage was worth saving. My approach came together naturally as I examined my feelings for Sherry, ultimately deciding it was time to tackle the issue head-on and bring it to an end. In the early years of our marriage, Sherry and I were inseparable, completely immersed in each other's lives and experiences. She was both my closest friend and my deepest love, yet somehow, all that seemed to fade. Maybe that's just how life goes. Nothing is permanent. Perhaps I had an idealistic, even outdated, view of marriage, picturing us as a united front against life's hurdles. Having both come from previous unsuccessful marriages, Sherry and I had sometimes wondered if the failure was in the U.S. or in the concept of marriage itself. How can two people expect to keep the same feelings, passions, and interests in a world that's constantly changing, shaped by fleeting trends, social media, and instant gratification? Maybe marriage, like dinosaurs and cassette tapes, was simply obsolete. For a brief moment, I even considered letting Sherry pursue her relationship with Todd, but that thought quickly vanished. There was no way I'd allow him to have a claim on my wife. I was ready to face this head-on. So, when Sherry called me just after lunch on Monday, I was prepared. "Hey, Sherry," I greeted her, noting that it had been a while since she'd called me during work hours, something I'd already mentioned in hopes that she'd reassure me. She responded with a warm hi. Honey, and I wondered fleetingly if she used that term with Todd too. Ignoring the thought, I asked if she'd be home on time to discuss whatever was on her mind. She confirmed she would, adding that she had something important to talk about, and I replied that I had something important to discuss as well. When she inquired about my news, I kept it vague, telling her we'd talk later. Excusing myself with the excuse of finishing my monthly report, I hung up, then informed my boss I'd be taking the rest of the day off, which he didn't mind. That evening, I waited at the kitchen table, feeling a mix of anticipation and calm as the garage door opened at 5:27. I kept my demeanor cool, despite my inner turmoil. I'd put a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc on ice and set out 2 glasses. She came in alone, tossing her keys and purse onto the table, and I felt relief that Todd wasn't with her, which would have complicated things. Smiling warmly, I greeted her with "Hi, sweetheart," echoing the affectionate term she had used earlier. I asked if she wanted a moment to settle in before we started, or if she'd prefer to dive into the conversation right away. Her surprise at my eagerness to talk was evident. She hadn't expected me to initiate so quickly. The look on her face told me she was off balance, and I planned to keep her that way. Noting her hesitance, I suggested I go first, asking if she was okay with that. After a moment's pause, she nodded, though she seemed uncertain. Without waiting, I poured us both a glass of wine. She accepted it gratefully, drinking half before I refilled her glass. I then started explaining that I'd been reflecting on things deeply, making it clear I didn't intend to drag things out. Pausing briefly for effect, I saw her lean forward, her eyes focused on me with curiosity. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice holding a hint of tension. I calmly told her I wanted a divorce, giving her time to process the statement. Confusion flickered across her face at first, as if my words weren't registering. Slowly, understanding dawned, and her expression shifted from confusion to shock, mingled with traces of fear and anxiety. She finally spoke, asking why, and I replied simply that my feelings had changed. "I don't love you anymore," I stated. My words hit her hard, leaving her struggling to comprehend, as she stammered, "You what?" "I've fallen out of love with you, Sherry," I said, elaborating with a fabricated explanation that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened. In reality, I'd known for a while, though I'd avoided acknowledging it. She looked at me, bewildered. "What are you talking about?" Her face reflected her distress, and I sensed an emotional breakdown looming. Trying to clarify, I brought up the early days of our marriage, describing how we used to spend so much time together, sharing routines and hobbies. Sherry nodded as I reminisced about our lunches, the anticipation of seeing each other at the end of the day, and shared pastimes like the pottery class she'd convinced me to join. Her gaze softened as she remembered, clearly captivated by those memories. "It wasn't about the pottery," she said. "It was about doing it with you. I loved every moment, watching you and helping you, she recalled our shared hobby of painting Christmas village buildings, an activity we'd both enjoyed despite its tediousness. Together, we had assembled a display of painted houses, an endeavor we took pride in. She admitted that my creations were always better than hers, and I remembered those nights we spent applying paint in detail. Back then, I loved her completely. We'd even invested hours coloring large posters she'd bought on a trip to Myrtle Beach, years before adult coloring books became popular. We still had countless colored markers from those days, although, like our love, they had all dried up. When Sherry defensively insisted that her love hadn't faded, I chose to ignore her comment and continued. Our friends had always envied our relationship, remarking on how we did everything together. We took long walks every day, holding hands. When I had errands to run, like picking up a new line for the grass trimmer at the hardware store, she would come along. Likewise, when she wanted to shop for clothes, I'd wait outside the fitting room without complaint. Sherry questioned me, noting that I seemed to enjoy going along with her on shopping trips. I clarified that while I often spent those outings on my phone, not particularly engaged in the clothes, I was there to be with her. I emphasized that I didn't care what she chose because she looked great in everything, and instead of staying home watching sports, I chose to accompany her. We recalled how the other neighborhood women often gathered for bingo or bachelorette parties, activities Sherry never took part in. I reminded her of her reason for not joining them, saying she once mentioned preferring to spend time with me rather than with the chickens. As we reminisced about shared moments, we remembered many nights spent cuddling under the blankets, watching our favorite movie together. Sherry, brushing away a tear, mentioned how much she loved the film. I added that we must have seen it 100 times and expressed my hope that we'd continue watching it together. When I mentioned divorce, Sherry protested, saying she didn't want to end our marriage. She envisioned us growing old together, taking cooking and dancing classes, or simply lying in bed reading books side by side. But reflecting on our growing distance, I admitted I didn't know exactly when it began. Looking into her eyes, I reminded her how we once went out for meals 2 or 3 times a week, but over time, it became a once-a-week routine, mostly at her urging. She claimed to be too busy for lunch outside of work, which I discovered wasn't true, as she still went out but with someone else. Eventually, we stopped having lunch together altogether, and I started joining my coworkers instead, gradually finding their company enjoyable, perhaps even too much. In my explanation, I deliberately avoided blaming Sherry outright, as I didn't want to make her defensive or let the conversation become accusatory not yet. Our habit of coming home early to be together gradually faded, and we started working later and later. By the time we finally got home, we often felt distracted and distant from each other. When Sherry asked why I never brought this up before, I admitted she was right, though I'd raised these concerns multiple times. I conveyed a desire to understand why our time together seemed unimportant to her, feeling as if I were accepting responsibility for our distance. In truth, I knew it wasn't all on me. I understood that if I confronted her about Todd right away, the discussion would get nasty fast, and I wanted her to remember what we once had before considering her part in dismantling it. Eventually, we stopped doing nearly everything together. She started going to her friends' bachelorette parties while I went to poker nights. She'd head off to spas on weekends while I went golfing. We spent entire days without discussing anything more meaningful than the weather or the latest news. Our intimate life also suffered tiredness or disinterest frequently got in the way. Thinking back to the start of our marriage, I reminded her how we couldn't get enough of each other, sometimes being intimate 4 or 5 times a week, occasionally multiple times in a day. I recalled playfully touching her as she cooked or skipping meals just to be together. Even relaxing in the hot tub, once a regular part of our life, had been forgotten for over a year. When Sherry suggested that I no longer wanted intimacy, I refuted her claim, suspecting she was trying to shift blame to justify her actions. Laughing, I clarified, "Oh no, I never stopped wanting intimacy. I'm just as eager now as I was 10 years ago. I simply stopped wanting it with you." I knew this would hurt her deeply. She'd thought it was her rejecting me, but here I was telling her that I no longer wanted to be close to her. Sherry, taken aback, asked me what I meant. Casually, I explained that over time I lost interest because she seemed indifferent, uninterested in anything thrilling or remotely adventurous. I said it felt like she wanted to finish quickly so she could move on to more exciting activities, like knitting. I shared my desire for longer, more passionate weekends together and pointed out that she didn't even want me to make her feel amazing anymore. I labeled our physical encounters as dull and admitted to faking enjoyment in our last few encounters just to get through them. When Sherry protested, saying I couldn't have faked it, I reminded her that she insisted on certain precautions, even though she was on birth control. I explained how easy it was for me to feign satisfaction, simply by rolling away and disposing of an empty one. Her reaction was a mix of shock and embarrassment, and I added salt to the wound by suggesting, "It wasn't me, it was you." Her face turned red as she stared at me, visibly torn between anger, frustration, and shame. To ease the tension slightly, I refilled her glass, and she took a large sip. Continuing, I shared that it was inevitable we'd both begin seeking comfort elsewhere. When I said someone else, I clarified that I didn't mean myself, though she didn't realize that. Suddenly, Sherry asked, her tone angry, if I was cheating on her or if I'd fallen for someone else. I reassured her, affirming my commitment to our marriage and explaining how much I despised infidelity. I reminded her of our shared past with cheating spouses and emphasized my commitment to not repeating those mistakes. Sherry apologized, recognizing it was unfair to accuse me, and admitted she knew I wouldn't betray her that way. But she looked guilty, unable to meet my gaze, her hands trembling. Transitioning, I mentioned it would be fitting for us to be together one last time after the divorce, hinting that I might have found a new interest. Then, I revealed my big news, informing her I'd met with my lawyer and finalized the paperwork. Understood. I'll rewrite the original text without omitting or cutting any details, and I'll ensure that all information is fully retained. Sherry challenged me, noting that I did enjoy accompanying her during shopping trips. I explained that I was often on my phone, not particularly interested in the clothes, but rather there to be with her. I emphasized that I didn't mind what she chose, finding her beautiful in everything. I mentioned that I could have stayed home watching sports, but chose to be with her instead. We discussed how other women in the neighborhood gathered for activities like bingo or bachelorette parties, but Sherry never showed interest. Recalling her reason for not participating, I acknowledged her previous comment about preferring to hang out with me rather than with the chickens. Reflecting on our shared moments, we remembered cuddling under the covers on many nights, watching a favorite movie. Sherry, wiping a tear away, expressed her love for the film. I mentioned that we must have watched it at least 100 times and expressed a desire to continue watching it together. In response to my mention of divorce, Sherry exclaimed her reluctance to end the marriage. She envisioned growing old together, taking cooking and ballroom dancing lessons, or simply lying in bed and reading books. Expressing the growing estrangement between us, I admitted uncertainty about when it began. Looking intently into her eyes, I explained that we transitioned from dining out 2 or 3 days a week to a weekly occurrence, a change largely influenced by Sherry. She claimed a lack of time for lunch outside the office, which turned out to be untrue. She continued eating out, but with someone else. Eventually, we ceased having lunch together entirely, and I started joining my coworkers. I gradually found enjoyment in their company, perhaps even too much. In the conversation, I exaggerated the situation, making an effort not to place blame solely on Sherry. I wanted to avoid triggering defensiveness or turning the discussion into a scolding. It wasn't my goal, at least not yet. Our habit of coming home early to spend time together lost its significance. We began working later and later, and when we finally did return home, we often felt distant or distracted. Responding to Sherry's question about why I never talked about it, I acknowledged that she was right, despite having expressed these concerns many times before. I agreed with her, expressing a wish to understand why spending time together hadn't been important for her. I admitted feeling a sense of failure in that regard. I felt like I was taking responsibility for our estrangement, but that was far from the truth. I knew that if I hit Sherry with Todd first, we couldn't end the discussion without it getting nasty. I would never make her see my side of things. I'd just be the controlling, jealous idiot. Before I revealed what I knew, I wanted her to remember what we had and think about her role in destroying it. Gradually, we stopped doing almost everything together. She started going to her bachelorette parties, and I started going to poker nights. She'd go to spas on the weekends, and I'd go golfing. Sherry and I began to spend entire days without discussing anything beyond the weather or the latest news. Our lovemaking life also suffered, with fatigue or lack of interest often hindering our closeness. Reflecting on our early days of marriage, I pointed out how we couldn't get enough of each other. We used to engage in intimate activities 4 or 5 days a week, sometimes multiple times a day. I mentioned playfully fondling her while she cooked, skipping dinner to spend the night together. Activities like going to the hot tub, which used to be a regular part of our routine, had become non-existent for over a year. When Sherry suggested that I didn't want lovemaking anymore, I refuted the idea, finding it baseless. I believe she might be trying to shift blame onto me to justify her own behavior. In response, I laughed and clarified, "Oh God, no, I never stopped wanting lovemaking. I'm just as eager now as I was 10 years ago. I simply stopped wanting lovemaking with you. I knew that would hurt deeply." She thought she had rejected me physically, and here I was telling her that our lack of lovemaking was because I didn't want her. I almost would have laughed if I hadn't been so hurt. Sherry, taken aback, asked what I meant when I mentioned she didn't want to have lovemaking with me. I casually mentioned losing interest and described how, from my perspective, she seemed unresponsive and disinterested in anything exciting or remotely naughty. I suggested that it appeared as though she wanted to finish quickly and move on to more interesting activities like knitting. Expressing my desire for weekend lovemaking marathons, I emphasized that she didn't even want me to give her incredible pleasure. I labeled our physical encounters as boring and claimed that I had faked enjoyment in the last few instances just to get it over with. When Sherry objected, claiming that I came inside her, I reminded her that she insisted on using contraceptives despite being on birth control. I explained that she never paid attention to the contraceptives, making it easy for me to fake it by humming, rolling off, and disposing of the empty contraceptive. Her reaction was one of shock and embarrassment, and I admitted that my plan had worked. Apologizing, I added insult to injury by suggesting, "It was me, not you." She stared at me for a moment, her face flushed, tears drying. I wasn't sure if her expression reflected anger, frustration, or embarrassment. In an attempt to ease the tension, I refilled her empty glass, and she took a big sip. Continuing, I explained that it was only a matter of time before we started seeking companionship elsewhere. I clarified that when I said someone else, I didn't mean myself, though she wasn't aware of that distinction. Suddenly, Sherry asked angrily if I was cheating on her or in love with someone else. In response, I reassured her of my commitment to our marriage and emphasized my aversion to infidelity. I acknowledged our shared history of being betrayed by our previous spouses, expressing my dedication to not repeating those mistakes. Sherry apologized, recognizing the unfair accusation and agreeing that she knew I wouldn't engage in such behavior. However, she looked guilty and couldn't meet my gaze, her hands trembling. Transitioning to the topic of our intimate relationship, I suggested waiting until after the divorce to be together for the first time, hinting at a new love interest. I then revealed my big news, stating that I had met with my lawyer and finalized the paperwork. I responded by stating that it wasn't simply a mistake but a betrayal of our love. She insisted that her heart had always belonged to me and that I was the one person she would never want to give her body to another. I reminded her that she was the one who stopped me and questioned if my love for her was so minor that I couldn't defend it, expressing how much she meant to me and that I would have fought for her. Sherry claimed she would die for me. I then bluntly declared my lack of affection, causing her to scream and try to pull me toward her. Despite her apologies and pleas, I maintained that, although I believed she was sorry, it didn't change the fact that I no longer loved her. I assured her she still had Todd for comfort. When she revealed that Todd was married and only cared about a physical relationship, I grinned, remarking that his wife might have something to say about that. I informed her that Todd's wife and I had used the same divorce attorney, handing her a folder that contained the investigator's report, pictures of her and Todd, and details of the divorce proposal. I advised her to read the entire document. Sherry begged me not to proceed with these actions, suggesting that if I wanted to meet her at the bank, I should call and let her know. I rose from the table and left the house, ignoring the sounds of her crying. Update: Sherry struggled with the divorce, and to avoid a prolonged and costly legal process, I agreed when the judge recommended marriage counseling. The sessions exceeded my expectations, providing a safe space for us to communicate openly and without judgment. Sherry gained insight into why Todd's attention nearly destroyed our marriage, and I shared the pain and humiliation her actions had caused me. The counselor took pride in our progress, and after several sessions I moved back home, where we shared several passionate moments. Sherry eagerly fulfilled my desires in ways that had once been rare. A year later, we had rekindled the deep bond we shared at the beginning of our marriage. Sherry switched jobs and joined my company, so we commuted together and enjoyed lunch daily, not out of obligation but from genuine desire. In fact, we spent nearly all our time together. We decorated a small Christmas tree, completed neglected paintings, joined another ceramics class, and even signed up for ballroom dancing. To my surprise, a set of colored pens I found wasn't dried out. One evening, as we cuddled under a blanket watching You've Got Mail, Sherry kissed me and said she needed to talk. Tears filled her eyes, sparking a moment of panic as my heart skipped a beat. Without waiting for me to respond, Sherry revealed, "You're going to be a daddy." Smiling, I wiped away her tears and, imitating Tom Hanks, playfully whispered, "Don't cry, shop girl, so I guess I'm just a sucker for happy endings."